One Shot, Episode 3 title, The Pond Maid. Gabe stared down at the black-grey fish gliding through the still waters like it was tangled in translucent waves of silk. The strange shadow twisted and twirled elegantly, its brilliance disjointing it from the other fish. Gabe found himself somehow comforted and unsettled by the black koi's presence in the pond. They'd finally moved into the new house, much later than planned, but his mother had died soon before their first attempt to move. The boy, barely 10, had watched the pond take shape over the past few months, slowly becoming a small watery paradise with its elaborate rock formations and lily pads that floated lazily across the surface. Gabe was a little excited. His mother, named aptly after the same aquatic animal, would often rock him to sleep in her arms, first in a big old chair, and then in the hospital bed during the last few days they had shared. She would often tell him stories about the garden they were supposed to build together, the lilies they would plant. Then the weaker she became, and the more ghostly her hugs became, she would then only wheeze, her voice barely a whisper as she mumbled over and over again of the enchanting power of the koi pond, and how if he helped his father take really good care of it, he may see her reflection over its surface one day, but he had to be really, really good and stay strong. Gabe could only bite back tears during that time and simply nod. He at least knew he had become too old for fairy tales. Gabe sighed heavily, the tired exasperation of a man, not a boy. He still found himself every other day searching for her, his mother koi, over the ripples of the water's surface. Gabe's father, Leigh, had gone all out on the project, importing rare koi from across the globe, meticulously choosing each one. But this particular koi, the one that now swam close to Gabe's side of the pond, had appeared out of nowhere. That one's new, Gabe said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking any louder might disturb it. Gabe's father was busy on his headset with what the boy could barely describe as business. An important client, no doubt, but somehow Gabe's words had reached his father's ears. Leigh glanced over from where he stood, admiring the pond from a distance, hands stuffed in his pockets. Huh? Oh, yeah, I think so, he replied absent-mindedly. He squinted, tilting his head. I don't recall seeing a black one in the bunch. Must have slipped by me when they delivered them all. The fish, dark as a storm cloud with streaks of grey shimmering as though under moonlight, looked up at Gabe as if acknowledging his attention. There was something about it, again, something that simultaneously comforted and unsettled him. Its eyes were so expressive. It was unlike the vibrant oranges and whites of the other koi, which flitted around in carefree nonchalance. No, this one with its wavy, long curling fins moved rhythmically, more deliberately. Purposeful. Gabe couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him, studying him even. Later that evening, Gabe lay in his bed, the window of his room offering a perfect view of the pond outside. He couldn't sleep. His mind kept wandering back to the black koi. His father's half-hearted interest in it had only fed his curiosity. He knew his father was meticulous, especially when it came to the koi. For him to shrug off such an unusual fish was unlike him. Suddenly a splash echoed from the garden below. Gabe sat upright, heart racing, and peered out the window. The moon was high, casting a silver drape over the pond's surface. But what caught Gabe's attention wasn't the shimmering water. It was a figure by the edge of the pond. He squinted, leaning closer to the glass. There, at the water's edge, a small doe-eyed creature was dragging something out of the pond with eager, jerking movements. His breath caught as he recognized the black koi, its body half consumed by what looked like a seal pup. But this seal wasn't like the ones he'd seen on documentaries or the few times they'd gone to the coast. There was something unnatural about it, despite its large wet eyes and slick body. The way it gorged on the fish, the wild hunger in its gaze as it bit into the koi's flesh, it made Gabe's skin crawl. Still, Gabe found himself slipping out of bed, drawn to the scene outside. Barefoot and in his pajamas, he quietly crept down the stairs and out into the night air. The cool breeze stung his skin, but he barely felt it. His eyes were fixed on the seal, which by now had finished with the fish and was licking its lips with a satisfied grin. As he approached the edge of the pond, the seal turned to look at him. There was a moment of silence as the two stared at each other. Gabe's hand reached out instinctively, and the seal moved closer, almost as if offering itself to him. Tentatively, he stroked its head, feeling the sleek, damp fur beneath his fingers. Despite the eerie encounter, the creature felt warm, even welcoming. "You're not supposed to be here, are you?" Gabe whispered. The seal blinked, its eyes wide and innocent, but something about its stillness unnerved him. After a few moments, it slipped back into the water, disappearing into the depths of the pond without a trace. Gabe stood there for a long time, staring at the rippling water, wondering if what he had just seen was real. The next morning, Gabe could barely wait to tell his father. He was surprised how much he'd slept in, though. Running down to the table, Gabe cleared the frog in his throat and immediately gulped down his orange juice as he sat down with Leigh. "Dad," he said over breakfast, his words tumbling out, "there was a seal in the pond last night. It ate one of the koi, the black one." Leigh finished up his conversation and clicked off his hands free. He then took a moment to process his son's words. Leigh looked at Gabe with a raised eyebrow, chewing slowly on his toast. "A seal here? That's impossible, Gabe. We're miles from the shore and the water's too shallow. You probably just had a weird dream." "It wasn't a dream, I saw it. It was right there and it ate the fish." With a sigh, Leigh stood up and grabbed his jacket. "All right, let's go check on the pond then." They went out together into the garden. Gabe's heart pounded in his chest as they reached the pond's edge. At first neither he nor his father could spot it, but right as Gabe was about to announce his triumph, a fish peeked its head out of an old redundant pipe near the bottom edge of the pond. The black one, the one Gabe had been so sure was devoured, swam lazily near the surface, almost mocking him. But then a light rose in Leigh's eyes. He finally was taking in the black koi, as though truly acknowledging it for the first time. He bent down, getting as close as possible to the water's surface. The black koi swam up to meet him, barely a millimeter of living glass rippling between them. "Well, I'll be damned, aren't you a beauty?" he said quietly, a smile stretching across his face. "Where did it come from, Dad?" "No ideas, but she seems like a prize. I'd love to find out more." Then Leigh's face screwed up. He stood and counted all the koi, mumbled the numbers to himself, and then he counted as he pointed his finger. "Jesus, sorry, Gabe, I think one is missing." "Bloody pelicans," he said with a frustrated groan. "But I know what I saw, Dad." Leigh crossed his arms. "Sure, one is gone, but the black koi's fine. You must have imagined it." "But I saw. It was a dream, Gabe," Leigh cut him off. "Now come on. We'll throw a protector over the pond for now and head into town to run our errands. We'll also stop off at Miss Aggie's. I need her advice on some things for the pond anyway." Later that day they arrived at Aggie's, a seasoned aquatic hobbyist. She had helped Leigh set up the pond. She was a stout woman with wild white hair and a face that seemed to have been carved out of stone by the wind and salt of the sea. Her shop was a delightful hodgepodge of interests. The hard-grounded scientific acumen of scholarly obsession and the uplifting flittering songs of New Age spirituality. Many towers of thick binding and endless vines of shiny crystals. The entire environment was as complex and eclectic as its dweller. Leigh and Gabe approached the counter. "Hi, Miss Aggie," said Gabe brightly. "Been moseying past your place, boy. Seen enough shredded gold and wheat there. Bad omen, I got minerals for that. Actually, Aggie, I came about this fish, I can't place it." Leigh pulls out a picture of the fish. Aggie squints, trying to see it. Leigh rolls his eyes and turns the brightness on his phone's screen up. The old fish lady murmured something under her breath before letting out a sigh. She turned and waddled away looking for something while she hummed and hawed after every step. She came back with a big dusty book and opened it. Sticking her nose to the penmanship, she followed after her finger as it dragged across the page. "Ah, here it is, second floor at the back." Leigh nodded and placed the groceries beside his son. "You stay here, Gabe, I'll be right back." Aggie gave Leigh a nod of approval and the man jogged upstairs. "I don't like that fish," Gabe said, grumbling under his breath. Aggie tucked her swollen knuckles beneath the furthest edge of her desk and pulled herself forward. "A black fish is good luck, boy, especially when you weren't expecting it. But that makes no sense, 'cause black cats are bad luck." The woman teased loudly and threw her eyes in a circle. "Pish, that's just the lies of Christians and fools. Is everybody not Christian? Never you mind that." "Take care of that fish," Gabe nodded strongly, his little body wobbling. "You see, boy, there's a bitch. A what? A woman, well, a thing as pretty as a summer belle. But it's not a woman, got it? It's not a girl. Okay, lady, she's an especially rapacious eater." Gabe screwed up his face in confusion. "What does that mean?" "What does what mean, boy?" "Raru rasiptsush." "Oh, well, she likes to eat. Don't feed her, you cannot fill her belly." "Oh, she's not nice? Not even a little, Gabe. Honestly, she'd probably love you, seeing as you're a child unmothered." "So she's friendly. Maybe I'll see more of her," Gabe said, perking up. Gabe thought if a thing like that could exist and visit the pond, maybe his mother could too one day. He could see her again. "Don't feed her though, lad. But she does like children. Or so I've heard." Leigh's shoes thumped loudly as he rumbled down the stairs, book in hand. He poured open the pages in front of Aggie, to the page with a black koi fish. Gabe screwed up his face at the sight of the photo. "Dad, that's not her. Come on, not now, Gabe." The grown-ups are talking. Gabe snatched up the shopping bags and stomped over to the shop door with a loud groan. As Leigh wrapped up his conversation with Aggie, Gabe couldn't stop thinking about the seal, about the way it had looked at him with those wide, innocent eyes. He hadn't imagined it. He knew what he'd seen. But the next time he saw her, things would change. Thank you so much, Mags. Leigh dug in his pocket for a moment and clawed out a crumpled 20. Oh, no, this one's on the house, Mr. Livister. Leigh shot the woman a tight-lipped smile and ushered Gabe and the bags out of the shop, hastily. That night Gabe stayed up late on purpose, waiting. Sure enough, just as the clock struck midnight, he heard the familiar splash from outside. But this time it wasn't just a seal that appeared. From the pond emerged a girl, no older than 13, with long dripping hair, the color of dead wheat, rotting grains sewed throughout it. She had the same inky doe eyes as the seal from before. Her pupils were wide, blown and shining. Her lower body was still that of a seal, dark gray and thick. But her face, her arms, they were human. She waved at him, beckoning him closer. Gabe knew he should run, but instead he found himself walking towards her, mesmerized by her haunting beauty. She practically radiated ice-white light. Her pink lips curled into a little dimpled smile, and her big dark eyes shimmered. She leaned half out of the pond, laying across cobble and grass, arm and hand stretched out over the graying expanse between them. She didn't speak, but he understood what she wanted. Food. The next day Gabe awoke screaming. Leigh flew into the room, flinging the door open. What is it? What is it? My arm. Daddy, my arm. Gabe couldn't feel it. He couldn't move it. The limb burned and tingled endlessly, throbbing cold, and then burning with sharp jabs of pain. Leigh finally caught his breath and with a sigh sat down on the bed beside Gabe. He began flexing and moving his arm around. Dad, no, it hurts. Shh. I know, son. You just slept on it funny. This sucks, but it'll help it feel better. When the pain has finally subsided, Gabe and his father headed downstairs for breakfast. Gabe grabbed his juice and tried gulping it down, but he ended up coughing and spluttering all over himself and the table. Jesus, Gabe, Leigh cried in shock. Gabe rubbed his throat and chin, annoyed that the lump in his throat from before was still there. Leigh reached over the table and put his hand on Gabe's forehead. You might be catching a cold. I don't want to stay home today. Leigh sighed then and nodded. The two of them had made some progress, but there was still a sense of sterility between them. An unsaid thing in the shape of Coy. Leigh knew Gabe had lost his mother and he mourned deeply for his son's loss. But he also knew one day his boy would grow up and find someone else to love. Coy was it for Leigh. With this he ended up in these endless thought cycles, not knowing how to bridge the gap or fill the silence between them, until their reaper grew stale and the moment was missed. Leigh knew he couldn't replace Coy, but he just had to love him. Some time after school, Gabe decided spontaneously to go visit the fish lady. Aggie greeted him in her fun, eccentric way as usual. She offered him fish-shaped cookies and Gabe took one. As soon as he bit into it, his throat closed up and he could have sworn the crumble turned to rot and ash in his mouth. Aggie anticipated Gabe's need from the twisted look on his face and handed him a tissue. Gabe spat into it, gagging. Your mammy's gone, ain't she? Yes, we don't talk about it. I see, Aggie said, nodding softly. Gabe replied curtly. Truth is, this type of Selkie is attracted to unmothered children. Yeah, you already said that. Aggie suddenly stood up straight, her presence growing, her eyes tightly fixed on the boy, heavy. Gabe gulped, his body stiffening at the sudden change in atmosphere. Aggie's usual jovial smile had faded, and now stood before him was a stern worldly woman full of grace and power. You fed it, didn't you? The breath caught in Gabe's throat. Well? Margaret's voice boomed, a tone that demanded respect. Gabe was flustered, but he tried to force himself to speak. Tell me why, boy. I didn't think it was a big deal. Margaret's eyes narrowed in on the child. What did it promise you? She said, her words shooting out like bullets, him. Huh. How did you know? Gabe asked breathlessly. The woman's glare blared through him like a laser beam. She. I thought she could bring my mum to visit. If she, I mean, kept coming, I could see my mum. Margaret's towering presence deflated with a long tired sigh. You poor thing. Mom, I'm sorry. Aggie picked up one of the cookies and placed it in Gabe's hand. The cookie has lily powder in it. Aggie's voice was back to its sweet and soft nature. She put a shaking, swollen, knobby hand over the boy's. Gabe felt her care through the warmth her hand expressed into his. You're already under her spell. This is dangerous, lad. Gabe could only gulp down guiltily and then feel the lump in his throat bob back up, making him cough a little. I'm sorry. Don't apologize, lad, I'm sorry. Gabe nodded. He bit his lip, trying to hold back tears. Take the cookie, Gabe. Put it under your pillow, and it may help you resist the Selkie's call." Gabe felt a cold chill run down his spine. "What does it want?" A long pause fell between the two, and then Aggie let Gabe's hand go. To be full, over the next few nights Gabe snuck out to the pond to meet her. At first she was soft-spoken, her presence comforting, despite the strange circumstances. He would bring her scraps of food, small things from the kitchen, and she would eat them eagerly, her eyes never leaving his face. Another morning came, and Gabe's restful nights had officially gone into extinction. He ached all over, he could barely keep food down, and it hurt to get out of bed. Leigh was outside near the pond cursing as he swept because again more of his precious koi had been gobbled up. Bloody pellets. He also was sick and tired of the smell of perfume mixed with the stench of rotting fish and something musty and sour. Leigh groaned as he bent over to pack the gummy smooshed piles of wheatgrass into the dustpan. After cleaning up, he went into the house and began setting up the table for breakfast. Looking in the fridge, he growled loudly in annoyance, wondering where all the food was going. He was sure Gabe wasn't eating all of it. When he finally caught sight of his son, he couldn't help but gasp. Gabe's skin was sallow and his face was gaunt. His hair was slicked to the side and sticking to his forehead, looking damp and greasy. Leigh sat down then. "You can't go to school today, Gabriel," he said sternly. Gabe tried to nod, his breath wheezy. Leigh stayed on top of Gabe for the next week. He took time off from work, going back and forth from doctor's appointments, buying supplements, and making sure Gabe finished his meals. By the following Monday, Gabe was almost back to full strength and much more cheerful. After this improvement, Leigh took Gabe with him to the office every day, considering it a chance for them to bond further, as they hadn't spent much intentional time together since Koi passed. By the end of the following week, Gabe was begging to be allowed to go back to school. Leigh relented. They'd become so much closer over the last few weeks, and he was relieved to see his son was back to his cheery, independent self. But then the clock hit midnight once again, and Gabe was jolted awake by that familiar splash in the pond. Before he could even comprehend that he was on his feet, Gabe caught himself outside in the garden heading straight for her, the Selkie. This time he heard her voice calling to him inside his head, a sweet velvety voice twisting up and tightening like a torsion of fabric. Creaking, rubbing tense, Gabe handed the she-creature a plate full of raw meat and eggs. The girl happily took it from him and began to gobble the food down. When she was finished, blood trickling down her chin, she looked up at him, whimpering like a puppy. Gabe kneeled down, drifting in and out of awareness. The creature wrapped its arms around Gabe, her fingers much longer and pointier now. She breathed a deep, gentle sigh into his neck right before following that up with a deep, hard sniff. "I missed you," was all she said, a petite, honey-drenched voice, and she squeezed the boy even tighter. Gabe couldn't help but hug her back. He caught a whiff of lilies and looked at the still dark surface of the pond. He saw the moon was almost full, but had yet to see his mother. When they broke their embrace, the big black bulging pools of her eyes reflected nothing but a silvery shimmer. Gabe couldn't even catch a glimpse of his own reflection in them. The look she gave could almost be mistaken for loving, if it wasn't so obvious to the boy now that she was so undeniably predatory. Gabe picked up the plate and knew without words what she was trying to say to him. "I'm still hungry," always so sweet and tender, despite being so frosty to the touch. Gabe thought maybe it wasn't so bad being under the thrall of a Selkie. She was nice to him and always asked politely, even though the illusion of free will had since worn off by then. But as time passed, the girl became more and more demanding. Her once soft, angelic voice grew rough, almost menacing, as she urged him to bring more. And each night she seemed to change, her face growing paler, her hair more tangled, her teeth sharper. Her once beautiful features now looked like something bloated and decayed, as if she had been left to rot beneath the sea. "Gabe," she whispered one night, her voice bereft of its usual intoxicating sweetness, "I'm still hungry." When Gabe hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes, she lunged at him, her mouth stretching unnaturally wide, gaping into a dark, monstrous pit. Her sharp teeth glinting in the moonlight. Water gushed forcefully into the air with the sheer force and violence of her movements in seconds, pooling up like a ghostly translucent mountain floating on the surface of the wind, before splitting in two open palms that lethargically fell towards Gabe. It all must have happened in mere moments, but to Gabe, everything had almost stilled itself before his eyes. The waves that reached for him languidly echoed the first night the creature had called to him so lovingly, so softly, now encased him, so that same hand, bloated, deformed, and smelling of decay, reached out now to ensnare him with the most putrid of disdain. But before she could sink her teeth into him, the black koi shot up from the depths of the pond, colliding with her. There was a flash of silver scales, dancing through the air like defiant sparks of stardust. A furious screech ripped out of the selkie. Her body viciously snapped back on itself as she was dragged by a swirling torrent under the water. Gabe collapsed by the edge of the pond, gasping for air. He didn't remember how long he lay there before darkness overtook him. Leigh woke up the next morning and went to check on Gabe, still worried about the boy's recovery from the cold. He wasn't in his room. Leigh scraped his fingers through his hair in frustration. Then he caught a glimpse of something outside the bedroom window. A cold chill gripped his spine, and Leigh burst out of the house into the garden at a breakneck speed. When Leigh found Gabe, his son was unconscious, his body limp, clammy and cold, as though all life had been drained out of him. The doctors couldn't explain it. Gabe had slipped into an idiopathic coma with no signs of injury or illness. When Leigh finally got home, he went to Gabe's room, sat on his bed and broke down. He wailed painful cries. "My boy, my little boy. Why, why?" he cried, tears streaming down his cheeks. Leigh grabbed Gabe's pillow and crushed it against his face, taking in his little boy's scent. Leigh had decided then he couldn't cope with another loss. First koi now, Gabe. If there was a God, he was a cruel one. Leigh heaved his son's scent into his lungs more and more through muffled cries of sorrow. Then he started to catch a whiff of something strange but familiar. Leigh pulled the pillow away from his nose, the case now partly damp with his tears, and turned it on its side. He could just about make out a shape at the bottom of the case. He searched through the opening, and it wasn't long before he found something. A cookie shaped like a fish broken in two pieces. He smelled it. The cookie was definitely the source of that strange odor, but it wasn't rotting or stale. Rather, floral. Leigh knew then where Gabe had gotten this strange treat from. Desperate for answers, Leigh returned to Aggie's shop. He slammed the book he had borrowed onto the counter and demanded to know what was happening to his son. Aggie, unfazed by Leigh's intense emotions, picked the book up and plopped it under the cash register. "I heard your boy's sick," she said softly. "Something weird's been going on. I know I sound crazy, but I can feel it in my bones. I took him to the hospital and the doctors can't help you now." Leigh slammed his fists on the counter, the loud bang snapping all ambiance into a painful silence. The quiet tension lingered on for a while. Aggie dared not break it. "What do I do?" Leigh's voice was thick with panic. Aggie sighed deeply. "There's only one way to bring him back. You have to confront her, make her release Gabe. But be warned, she won't give him up easily. She'll be hungry, and she'll want something in return. Her. Wait. It's a person. Yes, of course. Well, what should I do then? Call the cops." Aggie shook her head. No, no. What kind of she is it?" "Selkie. Kinda somewhere between a shapeshifter and a mermaid." "How do I summon it?" "Well, it's more akin to provoking it." "Well, how do I provoke it, then?" "Listen carefully. The moon will be full tonight, so you only have this one single chance." Leigh nodded, determination stealing his features. He didn't care what it took. He would get his son back. "Buy fresh table salt, no sea salt. Has to be man-made table salt. Mix it with earth from your garden and some drops of your blood. Salt of the earth to repel her and remind her that the human world is not her domain. The blood of the thing she desires to possess most. Mortal satisfaction. You're going to need a lot. Mix at least 1 bucket full. Pour this mixture into the pond after 9 p.m., and she will likely come up to challenge the disturbance." Leigh thanked Aggie profusely and headed off back home. Leigh stood at the edge of the pond that night, clutching a torch in one hand and the earth in the other. The flickering light of the torch cast eerie shadows across the water. The wind was cold, biting through his jacket, but he ignored it. His gaze was fixed on the still surface of the pond, his heart racing as he prepared to face the creature that had stolen his son's soul. Aggie had given him strict instructions, but also a little tidbit that he only just managed to catch on his way out the door. "The black koi is your ally," she had said. "It may be the key to breaking the curse. Watch for it," but Leigh didn't need to. The pond was completely barren now, and only the black koi remained. Like before, it approached him first. Leigh smelled lilies as he bent down towards it. "Please help me," he whispered to the fish. Leigh wasn't sure if it had been his imagination or an obscurity of the pond, but he could have sworn that the little shadow had nodded in reply. Leigh decided to waste no more time. He grabbed the bucket and began to pour the soil into the pond. The black koi swam to the edge out of the way as he did this. Once finished, he tossed the pail aside and began to wait. At the strike of midnight, the water rippled, and Leigh saw a shape begin to emerge out of the pitch black. Leigh took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage he had. He hadn't been able to protect his son from the Selkie's pull, but now he had a chance to set things right. He couldn't fail Gabe again. The Selkie appeared first as a seal, its wet eyes gleaming in the darkness, but soon it began to transform. The seal's form stretched, and the girl with long tangled hair and haunting eyes rose from the pond. Only now her beauty was gone. Her skin was pale and slick with slime, her lips blue, and her teeth, razor-sharp and bent in a wicked smile, gleaming in the torchlight. "I've been expecting you," she hissed, her voice a sickening gurgle, as though she had drowned 1,000 times over, yet somehow still managed to feign some coyness. Leigh swallowed hard, the hairs in his nose burning. The stench was overwhelming, putrid. "I want my son back." The Selkie tilted her head, her eyes narrowing with amusement. "He came to me willingly. He fed me night after night. You cannot take him from me. He belongs to the sea now." "I'll do whatever it takes," Leigh said, voice firm, despite the fear gnawing at him. "What do you want?" She smiled, her mouth stretching wider than it should, her sharp teeth catching the light. "What I've always wanted. To be fed, to be full." She plunged half out of the pond, foul water following her with a burp as she did so. She leaned to get closer, her pale hands stretched out reaching straining, her fingers long and webbed. "Give me yourself, and I will let the boy go." Leigh's breath hitched. He had known it would come to this, his life in exchange for Gabe's. But before he could speak, a dark shape darted through the water, breaking the surface with a splash. The black koi. It swam between Leigh and the Selkie, its sleek body glistening like wet onyx. The Selkie snarled, her gaze fixed on the fish. "Move aside," she hissed, her voice no longer coy but filled with venom. The black koi didn't budge, leaping in and out of the water again and again, hovering through the air, twisting and turning beautifully like it had done day after day since it appeared in the pond, slipping through suspended beads of glass. The Selkie drew back from Leigh with a loud growl that quickly devolved into a screech. Leigh's pulse quickened. Was this it, the moment Aggie had told him about? His one chance? Leigh stepped forward and allowed instinct to take over. "You don't control him," Leigh said, his voice rising. "He's not yours." The Selkie's eyes flashed, and she let out a shriek that sent chills down Leigh's spine. The water around her began to churn, and her form shifted again, growing even more monstrous. Her once human-like face fully distorted, her body elongating further, her teeth growing even sharper, her claws glinting like broken glass. She lunged at the koi, her hunger and fury unleashed. But the koi was faster. It twisted and turned, dodging her strikes, its movements graceful and fluid. It leapt from the water, landing with a splash on the other side of the pond, the scent of lilies rising above and drowning out the stench of stagnation and rot. And for the briefest moment Leigh saw something hidden in the koi's dark scales. Like he'd been hit by electricity, Leigh suddenly knew what to do next and jolted into action. He retrieved the small pouch of salted earth from his pocket, the essence of the land, the one thing that could break the Selkie's hold on his boy. "Release my son," Leigh shouted, throwing earth over the Selkie. The Selkie shrieked again, the water around her hissing and bubbling. She thrashed wildly, her claws reaching out toward Leigh, but the black koi moved between them, its body glowing faintly in the moonlight. The Selkie's form began to distort, her features warping as the earth took effect. Her once deadly gaze softened, turning mournful, almost pleading. "No," she screamed, her voice cracking with despair. "I'm so fucking hungry." The black koi swam closer to her and wrapped its sleek body around hers, pulling her down into the depths of the pond. The water stilled and the Selkie's cries faded into the night. Leigh collapsed to his knees, breathless, his heart pounding in his chest. It was over. Moments later the pond rippled again, but this time it wasn't the Selkie emerging. It was Gabe. Well, his spirit. The shape of him rippling and puffing like heavy fog over a morning sea. Pale, delicate, yet tangible. He slowly rose from the water, a figure standing behind him with one hand on his shoulder. "Dad!" Gabe's voice was echoey and distant, but joyful. Leigh rushed to his son, pulling him into his arms, tears streaming down his face. "Gabe, thank God. You're okay." "Yeah, well, I've got to get back to my body." Leigh smiled and nodded, tears pouring down his face. "Thanks, Mum." Gabe rushed through his father like smoke and disappeared over the sunrise. She was going to take him, but the koi. It saved us. Koi smiled sweetly, her features still as beautiful as the day Leigh first met her, though they waxed and waned with her near intangible form. She dropped her hand gently into the pond and picked up the little fish, cradling it nurturingly. The little fish, she was panting tired. Leigh approached and gave her a gentle pat with his fingers. "You were here all along." my love. Here with you always, my sweet gardener, but not all the time, you understand." More tears poured out of Leigh's eyes. "Yes, yes, my love, my koi." Leigh's phone started buzzing. He instinctively picked it up. His eyes had only lowered for a second, but when he looked back up, she and the fish were gone. He looked at the pond, and it was bone dry now. "Sir, hello, Mr. Levester." "Yes, sir, I'm here." "Your son Gabe is awake." Leigh glanced at the pond again, at the place where the black koi had vanished with his wife. There sprouted out of the bottom was a small bunch of wild lilies. He nodded, understanding now. He knew they would never speak of the Selkie again, but the memory of her would always linger, a bittersweet reminder of the night he had almost lost his son. But there was peace now. The sun was breaking over the horizon. The curse was broken, and though the black koi was gone, he could feel his wife's presence all around him.